I'm not sure how the sound is because it's very windy. I was rocking this crystal cap earlier, but the wind blew it away. So rest in peace to that cap. Laying down like meters down. We lost it.
They ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
So we are on top of the walls of Dubrovnik right now, the old town of Dubrovnik, and a lot of the Game of Thrones scenes were taken here. We should show actually some drone footage of Dubrovnik right now, so you can see how big these walls are and how high they are as well. It's so sunny that we're filming with a ND filter on it, and I thought let's make a quick video about ND filters and if they do or don't make your footage look more cinematic. Also, do they fuck with your sharpness, do they fuck with your colors, do they take out reflections in the water, stuff like that. So we're gonna do some comparisons, we're gonna shoot some with and without. Alright, it's a few weeks later right now, back in Holland, and we are gonna talk about how ND filters are gonna make your videos more cinematic. Now, ND filters, what are those? ND filters, aka neutral density filters, are filters that can help you block out the light that's coming into the lens and onto the sensor. Basically, as everybody calls them, they are sunglasses for your lens. This is a variable ND filter, and while I'm turning this, you can see that the amount of light that's coming through is changing, and we also got normal ones. Now there's pros and cons in having a variable or having a normal ND filter. In my experience, you can get away with buying a bit of a cheaper normal ND filter, but you cannot really get away with buying a cheaper variable ND filter because it will have a few downsides which you will bump into eventually unless you don't care about those few things. Now, ND filters can mess around with your sharpness, as I mentioned before. This specific one, does not mess with my sharpness as far as I noticed. This one is from the brand Format High Tech, one I looked up before, which out of all the reviews was one of the better ones. This one is also not a variable one, because if I would buy a variable one I would be spending hundreds and hundreds of bucks more, which I probably will eventually do, because there's also a lot of pros on the variable ND filters. What are the pros? Let's say you are a run and gunner, meaning you're around everywhere taking shots one after each other, just capturing the moment. And let's say you're shooting all kinds of different shots, then you want to quickly change the amount of light that's coming in per shot. So for the quick run and gunning, a variable ND filter is just ideal, because you can change everything so fast without changing your cinematic settings of your camera. Now, what I mean by that, the cinematic settings, the more important part. The cinematic settings of your camera, in my opinion, they are achieved by playing around with 4 different departures of your camera and lens combination. Those 4 different departures or settings are your frame rate, the frames per second you're shooting at, the ISO you're shooting at, the aperture you're shooting at, and also which aperture your lens can handle, and also the shutter speed you're shooting at. Now, the right combination of these 4 things will make it as cinematic as possible with your setup. Now right now I'm going to explain a rule to achieve a part of your cinematic look in your footage. It's a well-known rule, and if you're into filmmaking already, you probably know this rule already. It's about combining the right shutter speed with the right frame rate. Now the rule is as follows. If I'm shooting at 25 frames per second, I want to double that amount to get my right shutter speed, so that will be 50. Meaning I will shoot at 1/50th on my shutter speed. If I'm shooting my slow-mos at 100 frames per second, then I will double that, meaning I will shoot at 1/200th. 1/200th? Is that correct? I don't know. Now if you were shooting your slow-mos in 120 frames per second, 240 doesn't exist in shutter speed, so that will be 250. Try to get as close as possible. Now why is this rule here and what does it do? This rule is about getting a natural motion in your footage. So if I would wave around with my hands like this, it's pretty normal for the eye to be not able to catch up with the motion and making a blur. If you look at my hand, it will get blurry, and that's naturally for the eye and for the brain. So if you want to achieve a natural equals a cinematic look, you want to have a natural motion blur during your motion shots. I will give you an example of that in a minute. Another reason why I use these ND filters is to get the right dynamic range. You want to cut out the super bright parts of your shot so that the shot itself is more evened out, with the darker parts and the brighter parts getting more together, meaning that the dynamic range, that every detail in the picture, every detail in the highlighted parts and every detail in the darker parts of the shot is still visible. To sum it up real quick, you're using your ND filter to kill your overexposed parts, to then get better dynamic range, to get better gradings after that, so you can better color correct and color grade your footage. And if you can better color grade your footage, you will have a better cinematic look. And for the natural motion blur, which then will also add to the cinematic total look. Especially with drone shots, I always use my ND filters. I got a pack here of ND4, ND8 or ND16, and these are also polarized. I'm not gonna dive too much into polarizing filters because that's a total different subject, but to keep it short, polarized filters will actually take out the reflections in that shot. So if you're filming the sea and you got a lot of like white reflections on the water, it will take out those white reflections and make you able to see more of the blue sea itself. Or if it's really clear water, you can see through. So if there's like rocks and everything down there, you can actually see the rocks, you can see the bottom.
Now my whole team fucking here.
Using a Polaroid and ND combo, which is this one. This one is an old set from Polar Pro. I got it like 2 years back when I bought my drone as well. Probably by now they got newer versions of this, but I like those. I like those a lot, the Polar Pro ones. Where was I? Concentration, dude. All this talking. This talking is not my thing. I want to show. Let's stop talking, let's show some. Alright, so we are in Premiere Pro right now. It's the Adobe software that I use to edit most of the videos. I'm working on 2 screens, by the way, that's why you don't see my timeline and everything. But I don't think the timeline is important for now. What you see here is a very overexposed picture. After we put the ND filter on, it's all good again. If we take it off again, you see what happens. Now put it on one more time. And off. I think it's very clear for everybody right now. This is shot at a shutter speed of 1/50th, aperture of 1.8 and an ISO of 800. Why 800, you ask, on a bright day? Because 800 is the lowest it gets in this specific picture profile of Sony. So I filmed this moron walking around, moving with his hands, and why? To catch the natural looking blur. This is with the ND filter and the ideal situation to catch it as cinematic as possible. Also, because there's an aperture of 1.8, it's very blurry in the background, which is the look that I like to go for. If I pause it here right now, you can see that the hands are blurry, everything that is moving is blurry, and that's the natural look you want to get. Now, the second one is at a shutter speed of 1/50th to keep the natural blur, but at a aperture of f/18, because I'm filming without a ND filter. So this is one of the 2 alternatives. If you want to shoot without a ND filter, in this case, if you mess with your aperture and put it really high to compensate for the brightness, you will then lose all the depth of field. So there's no more unsharpened background, no more sweet bokeh or creamy bokeh as we like to say. though when I pause it, we do have a very natural looking blur, a natural looking motion blur. But then again, the shallow depth of field is gone because of the aperture that we have to put on 18, f18. Now the other option to compensate while not having an ND filter, but you still want to have the shallow depth of field and underexpose this overexposed scene, is by turning up your shutter speed. Now this is where the motion blur gets lost, and if I play this, you can see this moron doing his thing, but he's moving, and if you see the hands moving around, you can see that the hands are moving around very choppy. It's not going in any of a natural blur, it's going more like they teleporting per piece of, it's like this, instead of this. It's just, the blurry background is still there. That's a good thing. That's a good alternative for this option. Like if I wouldn't have an ND filter, I would just bump up my shutter speed. So the motion would be messed up, but you still got the shallow depth of field. That's what I did before I had any ND filters. On the left is the ideal situation. It's not having any super highlighted parts. It got the blurry background and the guy is in focus. Now on the second situation here, we got the guy actually out of focus, no blurry background. And in the third situation, we do got the blurry background, but the problem with this situation starts when there's motion in your shot. Talking about motion blur, this is an example from Thailand, and you can see these guys passing by, and as they pass by, the background is having this motion blur. This is just perfect. You can see how in the corners the sea is passing by, very motion blurred again. I'm saying this word over and over, but very motion blurred, and that's what we're trying to get. That's what we're trying to go for here. You can see everything on the boat is sharp. Now this type of cinematic look and cinematic motion blur is what we call goals. And if filmmaking would have certain categories, then this would probably be in the category such as busty, natural, amateur, something like that. This is another example on the boat where you can see everything is exposed well. You can still see the darker parts of the shadows here, and when we're looking up, you can see everything on the sky, the white clouds, the blue parts in the sky. Now when we're going down again, and that's where the variable ND filter comes into play, I don't have to touch my settings. I'm just gonna turn the variable ND filter to get my exposure right. I can keep continuing using my cinematic settings when passing by this beautiful place. Now here's a different example. This is shot on the Mavic Pro. I did use an ND filter, but it was the ND4. While looking back at this, not knowing that much about ND filters yet, about 2 years ago, and not knowing about my Mavic Pro that much, I should have used the ND6 in here, and you can see that in the sky. The sky is all white, while on the right side of the picture you can see that there is actually clouds and there is actually blue parts on this shot as well, but you just cannot see it because it's overexposed. While the whole picture is not too bright, but just the brighter parts. This is a perfect example of why you need ND filters specifically for your drone, because you lose that much on an aerial shot. Now on a situation like this, when you put on an ND filter, it will give you more depth in those brighter parts. So brighter parts in this picture are almost everything, right? Everything is white or light gray. So I would have more depth in these snow mountains than you see right now. Alright, next up would be the shots that we took in Dubrovnik. Here we got the flag situation going on. On the left side we see the picture that is filmed with the ND filter on. On the right side we see the picture that is filmed without a ND filter on. The left picture has more dynamic range.
Why?
Why? Because it's less bright in the overexposed parts. There are actually no overexposed parts. That is what gives you more room to play with. But let's look at the sharpness. Just by looking at this I can see no difference, so that's why I'm gonna zoom in. There is, as far as I could tell, no difference at all in sharpness. And this shot is taken without ND filter, and you can see how bright the background is, while it actually is a blue sky. A same kind of shot with ND filter on, you can see how blue the sky is. Now what we're seeing right here can be two things. Or Airman is just bored by my talking about ND filters, or this is proof of the damage that has been done by the nightlife of Dubrovnik the day before. yeah, this ND filter doesn't have a polarizer in it as well. If I would use a polarizer on here as well, you can remove all the glittering and all the reflection on the water as well. That would have been ideal here. Close up here, the sharpness seems the same. The left one is just less exposed. With this one, for example, I can directly tell the difference in shutter speed. The right one is way more glitchy, way more stuttering, and the left one looks more natural. They're both shot while walking, so they will both have this. I'm not stabilizing any of them more than the other, not on purpose. You can clearly see the sky difference. The whole sky is overexposed, while the brightness of the picture itself is probably the same. Like these walls, for example, are not less or more exposed. Also, there's something strange going on here. I think that Airman's body is noticing that it's being filmed without ND filter and automatically starts moving around like Conor McGregor. Now, this is something that we cannot really blame him for. I think that's just an automatic reaction of the body, because the body is noticing that it's getting filmed without ND filter and that its cinematicness is getting touched. You cannot help this. This is a common problem, and people will act like there's nothing going on here. But there's something going on here. You can see there's something going on here.
Shut your fucking mouth, you'll do nothing.
Now, to sum up this informative video or tutorial, I want to show what you can actually do with the extra dynamic range that you got while using the ND filter. And I'm not gonna grade everything. This is not a video about color grading. If you would do a video about color grading, like cinematic color grading, whatever, that could be a whole video by itself. So here is the shot with the flag. It's the same grading on both, by the way. I can directly tell which is my favorite and which looks less digital and which one looks more cinematic. This is ungraded. Here you can see it gets more of a yellow kind of tint. Now moving on to the one that is filmed with ND filter. This looks so much more cinematic. There's also more blue in the sky, while it's on exactly the same location. Now that color grading part wraps up this video. If you haven't checked the previous video about editing in Lightroom, editing your Instagram photos, then check that one out as well. Thanks again for watching. I hope this video was informative and that you learned something about it. Also, if you have a specific ND filter yourself, or a polarization filter, or a UV filter, which you'd like to share your thoughts about, the negative or positive thoughts, then drop them down below. I'm interested in which brands you think are good, or just whatever you want to comment. Throw your comments down below. And just as last time, I don't know when the next video will drop, but until that next video, meanwhile, you can check out the gram and peace out.
Goodbye.